The king's body was discovered in the throne room at dawn when the night guard, receiving no response after knocking 3 times, decided to break down the door. His arms were clasped in the embrace of a woman dressed in black, whose face was never identified. The monarch's skin was cold, but not all of it. There was still warmth around his chest and neck, as if death had come only moments before. Deep bruises darkened under his eyes. His lips were cracked and covered with dark foam, and strange marks were visible on his temples, as if from fingernails digging into his skin. The air was thick with the smell of blood, incense, and something rotten, vaguely reminiscent of the dampness of an old crypt. On the floor, directly beneath the throne, the remains of candles smoldered, and nearby lay an overturned bowl containing a thick, dark brown liquid. Later, under torture, the servants would say that during the night, quiet singing could be heard from the hall, interrupted by sharp female laughter and the king's coughing. 2 months before this scene, the sovereign's health began to deteriorate rapidly. Contemporaries wrote that in the spring he could stand on the balcony for hours and receive reports, but by summer he was unable to climb the stairs without assistance. His face was gaunt. Dark circles appeared under his eyes, and the skin on his hands became blotchy with a yellowish tint. Rumors circulated in the palace that his illness was punishment for secret meetings with a woman whom the people called the Witch of the Northern Marshes. She was seen several times in the corridors, although she was not listed among the entourage or the court favorites. The court physicians, following the customs of the time, resorted to bloodletting up to 3 times a week, draining half a cup of blood from the monarch per procedure. Ointments made from crushed silver and dried herbs did not help, and opium only temporarily dulled the pain and gave him a short, restless sleep. By nightfall, feverish attacks began, and the king raved, calling out the name of his long-dead mother and complaining that someone was whispering and breathing in his ear. Several servants claimed to have seen him reaching out into the darkness in his half-sleep, as if trying to embrace someone. Tension grew in the councils of ministers. The old nobles believed that the throne should pass to the legitimate heir, the king's younger brother, but supporters of the young queen whispered about her pregnancy and the possible birth of a direct heir. An unspoken war raged between the court factions. Documents disappeared, guards were bribed, and the wine in the cups was checked several times a day. According to the Secretary of the Treasury, in early autumn, the king began to ask for black candles and bowls of warm sheep's blood to be brought to his chambers. He claimed that this cleansed the heart of rot. One of the priests who was allowed to hear confessions turned pale after talking to the sovereign and refused to spend the night in the palace. In the last week, the disease progressed. His legs swelled. Dark ulcers formed on his skin, from which a foul-smelling liquid oozed. His urine turned almost black, and his breathing became labored and wheezing. When he tried to stand up, his joints cracked, and his body buckled as if his bones had lost their strength. At the same time, according to reports from the guards, he increasingly went to the throne room at night and locked himself in there with the same woman. Rumors of a black mass began to spread even then. It was said that the king, having lost faith in forgiveness, sought protection from forces that promised to take away his fear of God's judgment. No one knew what was happening in the throne room, but the guards heard voices, blows, and a strange hum, as if someone were banging on copper vessels. On the very night he was found dead, The guards saw a witch enter the hall with a veil over her head and a long basket in her hands. No one saw her again, and she disappeared as if she had dissolved in the morning mist. The king's body was left untouched until noon, not out of respect, but out of fear. Those who first entered the throne room claimed that the skin on his face had taken on a waxy sheen, and that his pupils, though his eyes were closed, seemed to move beneath his eyelids. The servants summoned to carry him away refused to touch the body without the blessing of a priest. When the chaplain finally arrived, he ordered the monarch to be covered with a cloak. But when he lifted it, he noticed that the fabric was instantly soaked with moisture. The body gave off a sharp, sweetish, rotten smell, as if the corpse had been lying there not for an hour, but for many days. News of the death quickly spread throughout the palace, but access to the chambers and the hall was immediately blocked. The keys were taken from the guards, and the ministers began deliberating in a small circle. Outwardly, everything appeared to be in mourning, but inside, a struggle was already underway. The queen, pale and tearless, sat in her bedchamber under guard, while her closest servants were isolated. The deceased's brother ordered the guarding of the treasury and archives to be doubled, fearing that documents relating to land rights and military debts would be destroyed. While the political regrouping was going on, the court physicians began to examine the body. They recorded everything according to the custom of the time. Swelling of the lower limbs, multiple bruises on the chest and arms, rashes on the abdomen, thickening of the nails, and an unusual smell of the skin. It was recorded that when the mouth was opened, a thick dark clot came out of the larynx, resembling coagulated blood, but with a shade reminiscent of soot. One of the doctors suggested that this was the result of internal decay, while another insisted on poisoning. According to two guards in his last days, the king hardly left the room where he was found, and even spent the night there. They saw vessels with hot liquid and dark bread being brought into the room at midnight, followed by a quiet female voice reading words they did not understand. One admitted that he heard the king screaming that fire was burning his bones, and then fell silent for several minutes. The church reacted ambiguously. The archbishop sent a letter expressing his sorrow, but in a private conversation with his advisors, he said that the deceased had not died in peace with God, and that the funeral service should be held in private without a public farewell. This caused outrage among the nobility, but they were quickly calmed down, reminded that any scandal would damage the prestige of the state. Meanwhile, stories about the woman who had appeared at night spread among the servants. Some said she was a witch, others that she was a mistress who had been banished from the palace many years ago and had returned to take his soul. Several people claimed to have seen scratches on the king's chest in the shape of a circle, inside which the skin was darker and looked as if it had been burned. When the day of embalming arrived, the craftsmen encountered difficulties. The blood clotted so quickly that it was impossible to perform the usual procedures, and the internal organs gave off a pungent odor as if they had already begun to be eaten by worms. One of the apprentices present at the autopsy wrote in his diary that the liver was the color of coal, and the heart had a dark wine hue. All these details were carefully hidden from the people. Rumors of a black mass and a witch sitting on the throne with the king still leaked into the city. Crowds gathered at the palace gates, and the guards were forced to disperse them for fear of a riot. In the last days before his death, the king could hardly tell the time of day. He had a constant fever, and the sweat that poured from his body smelled sour and cloying, like rotten wine. The servants changed his wet sheets several times a night, wearing gloves dipped in vinegar so as not to inhale the smell. The monarch's eyes wandered, his pupils dilating and then almost disappearing, as if he were constantly reacting to invisible light or darkness. He spoke in a low voice, often repeating the same phrases, that they have already entered through the gate and that they are standing behind him. The doctors continued to bleed him, although by this point his body had become so weak that he lost consciousness after each procedure. Ointments made from crushed silver infused with wormwood were applied directly to the ulcers, but they only turned black. The swelling on his legs had become so severe that the skin cracked, exposing red, oozing areas. When he walked, fluid dripped from the wounds, leaving dark marks on the carpets. The political situation was getting worse. The king's brother tried to get the council to declare him regent, saying the king was crazy. But the queen's supporters kept stalling. They hoped that her pregnancy would give her a legitimate heir and get his brother off the throne. People in the streets were already saying that the government was paralyzed and taxes were getting tougher than when the king was alive. In the evenings, when only the closest people were allowed into the chambers, something happened that would later be called the Nights of Darkness. The king ordered that he be taken to the throne room, where black candles were arranged in a circle. He sat on the throne, wrapped in fur, and waited. The guards heard footsteps, soft, unhurried, and a woman's voice uttering words that did not sound like a prayer. Sometimes he laughed, sometimes he shouted, but more often he whispered so softly that the guards could not understand a word. According to one of the young pages, on the night before his death, the sovereign ordered a large bowl of ram's blood to be brought to him. He dipped his fingers in it and ran them across his chest, leaving uneven circles on his skin. A woman in black stood nearby, holding him by the shoulder and whispering something, while the hall smelled of burnt grass and resin. When the page was driven out, he turned around and noticed that the king's eyes were rolling back, and his head was tilted back as if he were falling asleep. By morning, his condition had deteriorated so much that he could not even stand. His speech became slurred and his breathing heavy. His face took on a grayish hue. His lips cracked and bled. By evening, he demanded that all the mirrors in the hall be covered with cloth, claiming that someone is standing there watching. The priest, summoned for confession, came out pale and silent, refusing to tell even the archbishop what he had heard. On the night of his death, candles were lit again in the throne room. None of the guards dared to enter, but until almost dawn, there were sounds of broken voices, muffled blows, and a noise like someone dragging a metal object across stone. When the doors were opened, the king was already dead, and the woman had disappeared. After the king's death, the palace was in a state of paralysis. The very next day after the body was discovered, secret meetings began between the three main groups: the supporters of the deceased's brother, the queen's entourage, and representatives of the church. Each side tried to get hold of the seals of power, the keys to the treasury, and access to the archives. At the same time, the palace itself was surrounded by guards, and none of the ordinary courtiers could leave without written permission. The funeral was postponed for 4 days, ostensibly because of the need for embalming. But in reality, because of disputes over the burial place, the archbishop insisted that the body should be buried without a public ceremony in the monastery crypt, as the king had died without repentance. The Council of Ministers demanded a lavish funeral, fearing that otherwise rumors would spread about the shameful circumstances of his death. In the end, it was agreed to hold the ceremony in private, but with a symbolic carrying of the coffin to the palace courtyard, so that the crowd could at least see it. The embalmers encountered serious difficulties. By the first day after death, the body had already begun to decompose. A thick liquid with a pungent odor was seeping from the mouth, and the abdomen was swollen. When they attempted to open the body, the liver and stomach were almost black, with signs of extensive hemorrhaging. One of the craftsmen wrote in his personal journal, "I have never seen bodies decay so quickly. It was as if worms were already living in him while he was still alive." To slow down the decomposition, they used more resin and herbs than usual, but the smell could not be concealed. People in the streets of the capital were already talking openly about a witch on the throne. They whispered that the king had renounced his faith, made a deal with dark forces, and paid with his life. In remote areas, riots broke out. Peasants refused to pay taxes, believing that the government had lost God's blessing. Inside the palace, the struggle for the throne reached its peak. The deceased's brother, having secured the support of part of the nobility, was already preparing to swear allegiance to himself as regent. But the queen, protected by her people, announced that she was carrying an heir. The church was in no hurry to recognize either side, waiting and gathering information about the sovereign's death. On the secret orders of the archbishop, the guards and servants who had served in the throne room in recent weeks were interrogated. Several people disappeared, and the bodies of 2 were found in the river downstream, showing no signs of violence, but with stones tied to their feet. A month after the funeral, some of the items used during the nighttime rituals were found in the palace cellars: black wax candles, blood-stained cloths, and dried bundles of unknown herbs. The documents about this were immediately destroyed, but the rumors spread even faster. The monarch's death changed the structure of power. Old advisors were removed, several estates passed to supporters of the new ruler, and the influence of the church grew. However, the country remained divided, and the memory of the Black Mass on the throne lived on among the people, as a reminder of a time when power and faith faltered in the face of fear and superstition.